Well, this morning we're going to wrap up our series on King David. For the last 6 weeks, we've been looking at the stories of David's life, not only so that we could learn about how his life impacts our faith story, but how it impacts our faith lives as modern Christians. And if you've been a part of this journey in any way, you've experienced that the stories of David are sometimes shocking, sometimes difficult to hear, but each one of them brings with it some valuable lessons for us, and today's story is certainly no different. Today's story is going to be the final story of his life, and we're going to visit with David on his deathbed and hear how his story comes to his ultimate end. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about David and a guy named Shimei. These two individuals had an encounter that I'm going to describe, and both of them are going to have to deal with issues of anger and resentment, and we're going to see how they do that and how their responses might help guide us as we work through those issues ourselves. Now, the story of David and Shimei actually begins with the story of David and Absalom. Absalom is David's son. And Absalom has decided that he's going to take over as king. He's going to overthrow his own father and take over the throne and become king of Israel. Now, this is part of the consequence, this division, this rift, this struggle between father and son is part of the consequence of David's sin against Bathsheba and all of the sins that spiraled out from that story. If you were here when we talked about that story, we learned that in spite of the sins that David committed, God forgave David immediately, wiped those sins away. But God made it very clear that while the sins had been forgiven, there were going to be some consequences. And those consequences were things that David was going to have to work through, and it wasn't going to be easy. This struggle with his own son is part of that journey. So Absalom has decided he's going to challenge his father for the throne, and David decides that he's just going to let Absalom be king. David loves his son, and David's love for his son is more important to him than being king. And so David decides he's just going to leave Jerusalem, he's going to leave the palace, and he's going to allow Absalom to become king without any fight or any struggle. So David gathers up his closest men, and they leave the palace, and they begin to head out of Jerusalem. Now, a quick side story here, which is just an important one of note, is on their way out, David and his men go to the Mount of Olives, and they pray. So on the night that David is betrayed, he goes and prays on the Mount of Olives. Sometime later, his descendant Jesus, on the night that he is betrayed, goes to the Mount of Olives and prays. Now, after David and his men prayed on the Mount of Olives, they left town, and as they were leaving town, Absalom is coming into town and assuming the throne. On their way out of town, David runs in to Shimei. And this is the part where he enters the story, and he enters in spectacular fashion. See, Shimei is a family member of King Saul. And King Saul was the king before David took over. And when David took over the throne, Shimei, in fear of his life, he goes underground. He just disappears because he's scared that his life is going to be at risk. And so the entire time that David is king, Shimei is hiding away for fear of his life. And as he is hiding, he grows in resentment and anger toward David. He believes that David is the cause of all of his suffering, and if only David hadn't come along, Saul would still be king, and he would still be living the life to which he had grown accustomed and was really enjoying. But now he was miserable. And over the years, his misery just created this intense hatred of David. So when he hears the news that David is on the way out of town, he's there to greet him. And he greets him with this string of insults, just hurling curse after curse after curse, following him along the road. And he's not just hurling insults. He begins to pick up rocks and just chuck them at David, just throwing them at him. And he's doing this all the while that they're leaving town. And it goes on for some time. It's really just super annoying. And it's so annoying that at one point, one of David's men just comes up to David and says, "Please, for the love of God. Can I kill him? David says, no. That's not the king I am. That is not what we're going to do. And I know it's hard to hear, but some of the things he's saying are actually true. I have caused death. I am a broken person. I've not been a great king. He's saying hurtful things, but not all of them are untrue. And so I think it's best for us just to let him express himself. We're going to keep on moving. And maybe if we show grace here, God will take these curses and turn them into blessings. And so they just keep walking. Heads down, step after step, while Shimei keeps following them, throwing rocks and hurling insults. Absalom isn't on the throne for long before he decides that he is going to kill his father. It's not enough for him that David has left town. He wants to end his life. So he gathers up his troops, and they go out to hunt down David and his men. And when they find them, a great battle breaks out. And in the fog of battle, Absalom, who is riding this gigantic war horse, the horse is running through the scene of battle, and it's kind of, it's just kind of messy and dusty, and everything's kicking up, and Absalom didn't see where he was going, and the horse takes him underneath a tree. And the tree has a big limb, and the limb is forked. And so as the horse goes underneath the tree, the limb catches Absalom right underneath the chin. And the horse keeps going, and Absalom does not. He's left hanging there by his neck in the crook of the limb of the tree, and he can't escape. And David's men see him, and they take out their swords, and they stab him to death as he hangs from the tree. It's a grisly scene. Listen, the Bible was Game of Thrones long before Game of Thrones came out. So they go and they tell David, your son has been killed. The battle's over, and we've won. And David, he just falls apart. And he cries out to God, why did you take the life of my son? I would rather have died. Why him? I would die 1,000 times for my son. The throne isn't that important. I mean, David he's just broken. He didn't care that his son had betrayed him. The love that he had for him was more important than anything he had. So David is devastated. They start the journey back to Jerusalem. And as they approach the city, guess who meets them? Shimei. And he walks up and his head is down. He doesn't have any rocks. He's not hurling any insults. He just presents himself before the king and says, I am so sorry. All that stuff that I said before, I didn't mean any of it. It just got the best of me, and I just let fly, and I am so sorry. I apologize. Look, I'm the first person to come out and greet you. That's got to count for something. And then he just blah, 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 blah. He's just going, till eventually one of David's men comes up and says, for the love of God, can I kill him? And David says, no, you can't. We've gone over this before. That's not the king that I am. And he turns to Shimei and he says to him, you don't have to hide anymore. As long as I am king, you are protected, you are safe. No one will harm you. Your life is not at risk. Two men, both with good reason to be resentful and angry toward the other. But they both handle that experience very differently. For Shimei, his resentment and anger grew and grew and grew over the years, and long before he had that outburst at David, he had been bursting inside. Every time he saw the king, every time he heard his name, every time he came to mind, David would just make Shimei's blood boil. His blood pressure would rise, and he would feel the anger within him. He just couldn't let it go. He carried the burden of anger and resentment every day, everywhere. David, on the other hand, who could have had plenty of reason to be angry and resentful toward Shimei, instead shows grace. As they leave the town and he's hurling insults and throwing rocks, David does not respond in kind. Instead, he offers kindness and continues the journey. When he comes back, instead of harboring resentment and anger for the way that Shimei treated him before, again offers grace and kindness to a person who's really hard to like. But David did so anyway. I wonder, how is it that you have responded to resentment in your life? Maybe that resentment is a long-standing one from someone who has hurt you some time ago, and you've carried it with you for some time, and it's grown within you, and every time you see that person's face or hear that person's name or run into that person in any way, their face shows up on your social media feed, you just can't help yourself, but you feel your blood pressure going up a little bit. Maybe it's not a long-standing anger or resentment. Maybe it's just more of the small, needling kind of resentment. You know, those little resentments that we build up toward others along the way, towards our friends and towards our spouses and towards our children and our parents. You know, just these little things that bother us, and we think it's not a big deal. I can let it go. It's okay. And then it happens again and again and again, and it starts to grow within us, and we find ourselves feeling it, working its way in our lives. Anger and resentment have a way of grabbing hold of us and keeping hold of us. And when they do, we have a choice as to which path we'll take. Are we going to walk in the shoes of Shimei? Or are we going to walk in the shoes of David? As I was thinking about these stories, there were a couple of scriptures that came to mind, and these scriptures are actually found in the New Testament, and so they came a long time after the story of David and Shimei, but I think they speak to it powerfully, and I think they speak to us as well. The first one comes from the book of Hebrews. There we read, "Make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one misses the grace of God and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many." The reason that this passage stuck out to me and came to mind for me is this image of the bitter root. Have you ever, I don't know if you're a gardener, but if you're a gardener or someone who goes out and pulls things from the ground, if you've pulled out a root vegetable or a plant that takes root into the soil, if that plant is young, if it's newly growing, you can pull it out of the ground with relative ease. But if you wait and let that plant grow and let that root dig its way into the ground, as you try to pull it out of the ground, it takes a lot more effort and it brings up a lot more of the earth with it, right? That's what happens for us when we hang on to resentment and anger. It starts to take root in us and it feels bitter. I mean, if you've experienced resentment and anger, the kind of we're talking about this morning, you know what I mean? There's just kind of a bitter taste to it. We don't like it, but it has its way of getting in us. And if we can deal with it early, while it's still young, it's new, it doesn't have the kind of grip on us. And we can remove it a whole lot easier than if we let it grow. If we let it grow and take root in our lives, over time it will get deeper and deeper within us. And when it comes time to finally pull it out, it's going to take a lot more effort and it's going to cause a lot more hurt. The other passage that came to mind, this one comes from Colossians, and here's what it says. "Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you." Now, David had been forgiven. He sinned mightily against Bathsheba and against her husband Uriah and all those people who were engaged and were a part of that story, and he was paying for that now. But when he confessed his sins, he was forgiven. And because he was forgiven, he was able to offer that forgiveness to others. That's the model that he was seeking to use. Now, we have been forgiven, and one of the best paths for us to let go of resentment and anger is to find that place in us where we can offer forgiveness. Now, forgiveness is a tricky thing. Forgiveness is not always easily offered, and I think there's a lot of things that get in our way when it comes to forgiveness. And when I talk about forgiveness, I always make it very clear that this whole idea of forgiving and forgetting, we need to forget that. Because I think it leads us into a place where we feel like we're failing at forgiveness. In fact, I think it's important for us to remember. Because sometimes by remembering the things that have hurt us, we might be able to prevent them from happening again in the future. We forgive and we try to let go. That's different than forgetting. It's hard to forget, and it's okay if you haven't forgotten. It doesn't mean that you're failing at forgiveness. It just means you're remembering something that hurt and was hard. And that's okay. Forgiveness, we know, is as much for us as it is about the other person. I know it feels good to be forgiven, but in this context, when we're talking about getting rid of resentment and we're talking about getting rid of anger that kind of grows as a bitterness within us, the forgiveness that we're working toward, that's for us. That's for ourselves. It's a process that lets us find healing. You've probably heard someone say that anger and resentment towards someone else that we hold toward them, trying to punish them in some way, is like swallowing poison and hoping your enemy will get sick, right? It doesn't work that way. And so if anger and resentment is the poison that we're swallowing and that we're keeping inside, then forgiveness is the antidote. And we work toward that forgiveness. Even if we don't work toward it perfectly, we work toward it so that we can let those things go and so that we can find our path, right? And David, again, these are stories in the Bible and they come and go. And as we look at David, we think, wow, he makes it look so easy. Well, it's a lot easier said than done, right? But if we want to find healing and wholeness in our life, we've got to find a way to move beyond those resentments, to find a way to forgive so that we can live. I want to tell you how David's story ends. And it is a shocking ending, to say the least. It's told in 1 Kings. And David is nearing his death, and he's on his deathbed, and everyone who's important is around him. It's one of those things we should all be so fortunate to be knowing that our time is coming and to be surrounded by the people that we love. And David goes around and he offers blessing and wisdom to those that matter most to him. It's really a very, very powerful scene. But after he does all of that, and he is nearing his final breath, he summons Solomon, his son, who will become king when David dies. And he says, Solomon, come here. So, if you've been with someone at the end of their life, their voices are soft, and so he's got to pull Solomon in, and Solomon's close, and he says to him, Solomon, do you remember that guy named Shimei? So I was like, I think so. He said, he was the one that when I was leaving town, he was throwing rocks and kicking dirt and hauling all yelling all those curses and all that stuff, and I promised him that he's going to be okay. You remember him? Solomon said, yeah, Dad, I do remember him. I remember that story, and I remember how you responded to that story. I remember that, Dad. He said, yeah, Solomon, this is what I want you to do. Kill him. No joke. Solomon, kill him. And the next line in Scripture reads, and David slept with his ancestors. Kill him, and David slept with his ancestors. Solomon, I promised him I'd keep him safe and sound while I was king, but after I die, I'm not king anymore. My promise doesn't have to be kept. Will you kill him for me? You see, we thought that David had done the work. He said all the right things. He made all the right promises. He seemed to be walking in all the right directions. But David didn't do the hard work. He did superficial work. But all along, while we think it's okay and he's really forgiven Shimei, and we see that as a model, what's really going on is inside a bitter root has taken hold of David, and it's dug itself in deep. Deep enough that the very last thing on his mind is not the people that he loves and cares about. The people who are surrounding him as he's about to enter into the next life. It's not about the things that God has done for him. It's not about any of those things that we would hope to be thinking about at the end of our life. That bitter root of resentment had gotten so far in there that right before he takes his last breath, I want you to kill him because I can't let it go. You know, there are people who think that this ending just ruins the rest of the story. Like, this is a bad ending. It needs a rewrite. Send it back to the authors and redo it because it is no good. I get that response because it's just shocking, right? Like the Game of Thrones shocking. It's bad. I'm actually glad it's in the story. And here's why. One, again, as the stories of David have done over and over and over again, they remind us that he is human. And he's broken, and he's flawed, and he's hurting. But they also serve for us an example of what not to do, right? So when we find ourselves struggling with resentment and struggling with anger, and we wonder where it's headed, well, if we're not careful, we may be headed to the same place. We may not offer the same instruction to our family members at the end of our life. But if our life is coming to an end, and we've let the bitter root of resentment take hold enough that that's what we're thinking about, then we haven't done the work. And it's hard work. I get it. My hope for us, though, is that we won't walk in David's shoes in this one. That we'll find a different path and a better path. And we'll make sure that that bitter root of resentment and anger doesn't get the best of us, so that when our time comes, we can celebrate the best of life. So that's how David's story ends. We've covered very little of the whole arc of his story. And in some ways, for me, it's hard to let the stories of David go. It feels a little bit for me like I'm closing a book that I really love, and I hate to see it go. I'm going to miss the characters and the story. But my hope for us is even as we leave the story behind, we'll take the lessons with us. Because these are lessons that are so important to our life and to our faith. And I think in them, we find a way to live. Not just like David, but the way Christ would have us live. Amen.